In January 1980, a bearded man wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a leather briefcase walked through the entrance of Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. His Canadian passport identified him as Kevin Costa Harkins, a film production manager from Toronto. Behind him, 5 other individuals, 3 men and 2 women, followed at casual intervals, each carrying luggage and the weary expressions of business travelers ready to return home after a week of work abroad. They moved through the terminal with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to international travel, chatting occasionally about locations they'd visited and shots they'd envisioned for their upcoming science fiction film. What the Revolutionary Guards manning the security checkpoints didn't know, what the Iranian immigration officials processing departure documents couldn't have suspected, was that none of these 6 people were actually Canadian. They were American diplomats who had been hiding in Tehran for 79 days, and the man leading them through the airport was a CIA officer named Tony Mendez, whose real mission had nothing to do with making movies. The briefcase he carried contained forged documents, fabricated production materials, and storyboards for a film that would never be made. If everything worked as planned, these 6 Americans would board a Swiss Air flight to Zurich within the next 2 hours and escape from one of the most dangerous situations any American diplomat had faced since the end of World War II. If anything went wrong, if a single document raised suspicion, if one person's nervous behavior triggered additional questioning, if Iranian intelligence had somehow learned that 6 Americans were unaccounted for, they would all be arrested, and what had already become an international crisis would escalate into something far worse.
The operation that brought Tony Mendez to Tehran in January 1980 had its origins in the chaotic morning of November 4, 1979, when several hundred Iranian students and militants stormed the United States Embassy compound in Tehran. The embassy occupation came in the aftermath of a revolution that had transformed Iran from a Western-aligned monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi into an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The revolutionaries who seized the embassy were demanding that the United States return the exiled Shah, who had fled Iran in January 1979 and was now receiving medical treatment for cancer at a hospital in New York. The militants viewed the embassy as a symbol of American interference in Iranian affairs and saw the hostage-taking as leverage to force the United States to hand over the Shah to face trial for crimes committed during his regime. The assault on the embassy began at approximately 10:30 in the morning Tehran time. Militants scaled the embassy walls, overwhelmed the Marine Guards who were under orders not to use lethal force, and rapidly took control of the compound. Within hours, 66 American diplomats, military personnel, and civilians found themselves prisoners in what had been sovereign U.S. territory just that morning. The hostage-takers bound their captives, blindfolded them, and paraded some before crowds of revolutionary supporters who had gathered outside the embassy gates, chanting anti-American slogans and burning American flags. But in the confusion of the initial assault, not everyone in the embassy compound was captured. 6 State Department employees managed to escape. Robert Anders was the consular officer responsible for visa processing and citizen services. Mark Lejak served as consular assistant, working alongside Anders in the same office. Cora Lejak, Mark's wife, worked as a consular associate. Joseph Stafford held the position of agricultural attaché, though his actual work involved more political and economic reporting than agriculture. Kathleen Stafford, Joe's wife, worked as a secretary in the immigration section. Henry Schatz served as agricultural officer, working with Joe Stafford on reports about Iran's economy and food production.
When the militants breached the embassy compound, these 6 individuals were working in the consular section, a building separate from the main chancery. As they heard shouting and saw the mob pouring through the gates, they made a split-second decision. Rather than barricading themselves inside and waiting to be captured, they would attempt to slip away during the chaos. The consular section had a side exit that opened onto a street outside the main compound walls. While the militants concentrated on the larger buildings and the majority of embassy personnel, Anders led the group of 6 out this side door and onto the Tehran streets. They walked quickly, but not frantically, trying to blend with the crowds of Iranians who had gathered to watch the embassy takeover. They were Americans in the middle of a violently anti-American mob, But they were dressed in ordinary business clothes rather than uniforms. And in the confusion, they weren't immediately identified. They split into smaller groups. Couples walking together looked less suspicious than a group of 6, and made their way away from the embassy district. The immediate question was where to go. They couldn't go to their apartments. Those addresses would be known to Iranian authorities once the embassy files were captured. They couldn't go to hotels. Registration would require showing passports, which would immediately identify them as Americans. They needed shelter, and they needed it quickly, before Iranian security forces began searching for anyone who might have escaped the embassy. Their first refuge came from John Sheardon, a Canadian embassy official whom several of the Americans knew professionally. Sheardon, learning that Americans had escaped and were desperately seeking shelter, made the courageous decision to take them in despite the enormous risks involved. Initially, the 6 Americans stayed at Sheardon's residence, sleeping on floors and in spare rooms, trying to remain as invisible as possible while they figured out what to do next.
Within days, Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor learned what Sheardon had done and faced a decision that would define his diplomatic career. Taylor could order the Americans to leave, protecting Canada's diplomatic mission and avoiding any potential complications with the Iranian government. Or he could authorize continued Canadian protection for the escapees, knowing that if the deception was discovered, Iran might retaliate against the entire Canadian embassy staff. Taylor consulted with his superiors in Ottawa and received authorization to continue providing shelter. The 6 Americans were moved to Taylor's residence, where they would remain hidden for the next 2.5 months, while officials in Washington tried to figure out how to extract them from Iran. The situation facing American intelligence agencies was unprecedented in its complexity. The 52 Americans held hostage in the embassy compound were at least protected by the international attention focused on their captivity. Iran couldn't simply execute them without facing severe global consequences. But the 6 Americans in hiding had no such protection. If they were discovered, the Iranian government could claim they were spies who had evaded capture, interrogate them, put them on trial, and potentially execute them, all while claiming they were merely enforcing Iranian law against illegal foreign agents operating in their country. Throughout November and December 1979, the CIA's Office of Technical Service, the division responsible for creating false documents, disguises, and cover identities for intelligence operations, worked through various extraction scenarios. Each plan was analyzed for vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and each was found lacking in different ways. One early proposal involved having the 6 Americans attempt an overland escape to Turkey. The route would take them hundreds of miles through mountain passes in winter, crossing terrain where they would be easily spotted as foreigners, and where Revolutionary Guard checkpoints monitored major roads. The plan required them to somehow obtain vehicles, navigate unfamiliar roads, pass through multiple checkpoints with forged documents, and reach the Turkish border without being intercepted. The risk assessment concluded this approach had less than a 30% chance of success. Another scenario involved disguised diplomatic pouch extraction, literally hiding the Americans in large diplomatic containers that would be transported out of the country with Canadian diplomatic cargo. But this plan required the cooperation of multiple Canadian officials, would take weeks to arrange, and had the problem that Iranian authorities had begun randomly inspecting diplomatic shipments, suspicious that the embassies might be smuggling materials related to intelligence operations. A third proposal suggested the Americans pose as teachers or educational consultants, using forged documents to claim they worked for a Canadian educational foundation conducting research in Iran. They would attempt to leave through normal airport departure procedures, relying on forged passports and the hope that Iranian immigration officials wouldn't scrutinize their documents too carefully. This plan had the advantage of relative simplicity, but the critical disadvantage that teachers and consultants would have difficulty explaining why they had been in Iran during a period of revolutionary upheaval and why they were leaving so suddenly. Each scenario was considered and rejected. The CIA's exfiltration specialists kept returning to the same fundamental problems. Any successful extraction required the 6 Americans to pass through Mehrabad Airport, which meant their documents had to be perfect, and their cover story had to be completely convincing. Iranian security forces had been placed on high alert for Americans trying to flee the country. Immigration officials had been given watch lists and were carefully examining every departing passenger who might be American. Revolutionary guards patrolled the airport looking for suspicious behavior. The environment was as hostile as any CIA officer could imagine.
It was in this context that Tony Mendez proposed an idea that initially seemed so absurd that some CIA officials thought he was joking. Mendes had joined the CIA in 1965 and had spent his career in the Office of Technical Service, specializing in what the agency called exfiltration operations, getting people out of dangerous situations without detection. Over 15 years, he had developed expertise in creating false identities, forging documents, and constructing cover stories that would withstand scrutiny. He had worked operations in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, always focusing on the practical details that made deceptions believable. Mendes's insight came from thinking about what would explain foreigners being in Tehran during the revolution, what would justify their presence at Canadian diplomatic residences, and what would provide a plausible reason for them to leave on short notice. The answer, he believed, was entertainment industry professionals. Specifically, a location scouting team for a Hollywood film production. The logic was counterintuitive but sound. Despite the revolutionary upheaval, Iran was still trying to maintain some international business relationships, particularly with countries that hadn't been directly involved in supporting the Shah's regime. Iranian officials had expressed interest in attracting foreign film productions to Iran, seeing the country's diverse landscapes, deserts, mountains, ancient ruins, as potential settings that could generate foreign currency and international attention. A film location scouting team would have logical reasons to be in Tehran. They would be looking at potential filming sites, which explained why they might travel around the city and surrounding areas. They would have connections to international businesses and diplomatic contacts, which explained why they might stay at embassy residences rather than hotels. They would be on tight production schedules, which explained why they might need to leave the country quickly once their scouting work was complete. And perhaps most importantly, film industry professionals were expected to be somewhat eccentric, creative types who might not fit the standard profile that security officials used to identify suspicious travelers. But Mendes understood that for this cover story to work, it couldn't simply be a lie told at the airport. It had to be real, or at least real enough that if Iranian intelligence investigated, they would find evidence of an actual film production. The cover story needed to have depth and substance. If an Iranian official called the production company, someone would need to answer. If they checked industry publications, they would need to find advertisements and announcements about the film. If they examined the documents and materials the fake film crew carried, everything needed to look professionally produced and authentic. This is where the operation moved beyond traditional intelligence work into something that resembled performance art and elaborate theatrical production. To create a convincing film production cover, Mendes would need help from people who actually worked in Hollywood and understood how legitimate productions operated. Mendes contacted John Chambers, a Hollywood makeup artist who had won an Academy Award in 1968 for his groundbreaking prosthetic work on Planet of the Apes. But Chambers wasn't simply a special effects artist. He'd been doing classified work for the CIA since the 1960s, creating disguises and false identities for intelligence officers operating undercover. The agency trusted him with sensitive operations, and he understood the stakes involved in intelligence work. When Mendes explained what he needed, Chambers immediately grasped both the audacity and the feasibility of the plan. He brought in Robert Seidel, a Hollywood production designer and associate producer who could help add authentic details to the fake production. Together, Mendes, Chambers, and Seidel would create what they needed: a film production that existed on paper, in trade publications, in office spaces, and in all the places where anyone investigating would look, but which would never actually produce a movie. The first step was selecting a screenplay. The script needed to be something that justified location scouting in the Middle East, specifically in places with exotic terrain, ancient architecture, and desert landscapes, all features that Iran possessed.
Chambers had connections throughout Hollywood and knew about various scripts that had been making the rounds but hadn't been produced. One script that seemed perfect for their purposes was titled Argo, a science fiction story set on a distant planet where rebel forces fought against an oppressive empire. The Argo screenplay had been written years earlier by a screenwriter whose career had never taken off, and the script had been languishing in development limbo, the Hollywood term for projects that studios expressed interest in but never actually committed to producing. CIA Chambers obtained the rights to the script, paying a nominal fee to the writer, who was thrilled that someone finally wanted to make his movie, and had no idea he was actually helping the CIA run an intelligence operation. With the script secured, the next step was creating the production company. They established Studio 6 Productions, a name that secretly referenced the 6 Americans who needed to be rescued, though anyone in Hollywood would simply assume it was a generic production company name. The CIA provided funds to rent actual office space at 1990 Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, right in the heart of the entertainment industry. The office was furnished with desks, filing cabinets, phones, and all the equipment a real production company would have. They hired a secretary who would answer phones and take messages, though she was told only that this was a legitimate film production and had no idea about the CIA connection.
The office walls were decorated with concept art and storyboards for Argo, showing alien landscapes, futuristic architecture, and elaborate costume designs. Chambers worked with Hollywood artists to create professional quality production materials that would pass inspection by anyone familiar with the film industry. The artwork was deliberately designed to suggest that the production would need exotic foreign locations, desert settings, ancient ruins, mountainous terrain, all features that justified why scouts might be looking at sites in Iran. To make Studio 6 Productions appear legitimate to anyone investigating from Iran, the operation needed visibility in the entertainment industry. Mendes and Chambers took out full-page advertisements in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, the 2 most prominent trade publications in the film industry. The advertisements announced that Studio 6 Productions was preparing to film Argo, a science fiction epic, and was currently in pre-production. The ads featured some of the concept art and listed a phone number that connected to the Sunset Boulevard office. They went further, organizing a script reading at a Hollywood venue, inviting actors and industry professionals to participate. The reading served multiple purposes. It created witnesses who could confirm that Argo was a real production being developed. It generated industry gossip and conversation that made the project seem legitimate. And it provided additional material for the cover story. If Iranian officials investigated and called people in Hollywood asking about Studio 6 Productions and Argo, they would find people who remembered the project and could confirm it existed. Business cards were printed for the various crew positions: producer, director, production manager, cinematographer, production designer, and art director. These cards listed the Sunset Boulevard address and phone number. Letterhead was created with the Studio 6 Productions logo. A bank account was established. Every detail was attended to, because Mendes understood that in intelligence work, authenticity came from accumulating small, verifiable details rather than creating one large, elaborate lie. While the Hollywood infrastructure was being built, another critical component of the operation was being arranged through diplomatic channels. For the 6 Americans to pose as Canadian film crew members, they would need Canadian passports and supporting identity documents. This required the cooperation of the Canadian government at the highest levels, and it represented an enormous ask. Canada would be putting its diplomatic relationships at risk, potentially endangering its own embassy staff in Tehran, and violating its own laws regarding passport issuance, all to help extract American diplomats. Ambassador Ken Taylor, who had already taken tremendous personal risks by sheltering the 6 Americans, now advocated strongly for Canadian government support of the extraction operation. He communicated with external affairs officials in Ottawa, explaining the situation and requesting authorization to provide false Canadian passports for the 6 Americans. The decision ultimately reached Prime Minister Joe Clark, who faced a choice between maintaining strict diplomatic neutrality and actively assisting a close ally in an intelligence operation. Clark authorized Canadian cooperation, a decision that would remain classified for years afterward to protect Canada's diplomatic relationships in the Middle East. Canadian external affairs officials worked with CIA personnel to create complete cover identities for the 6 Americans. Each person would receive a new name, a Canadian address, employment history, and biographical details that would withstand basic questioning. The passports would be genuine Canadian documents, not forgeries, issued through official channels, but containing false information about the holders' identities. Creating convincing cover identities required extensive background work. Each false Canadian identity needed internal consistency: hometown, educational background, work history, family details that could be maintained under pressure. The identities needed to match the roles the Americans would play as film crew members, but couldn't be too elaborate or detailed in ways that might invite complicated questions. The CIA's identity specialists worked with Canadian officials to develop legends, intelligence term for false biographies, that were detailed enough to be convincing, but simple enough to remember under stress.
Robert Anders would become Robert Baker, a production designer from Toronto. Mark Lejek would become Mark Steffen, a cinematographer from Vancouver. Cora Lejek would become Cora Steffen, a set designer and Mark's wife. Joseph Stafford would become Joseph Harris, an associate producer from Ottawa. Kathleen Stafford would become Kathleen Harris, a script consultant and Joe's wife. Henry Schatz would become Henry Lucas, an art director from Montreal. The Canadian passports were prepared with meticulous attention to detail. Each passport needed to appear well used, not brand new, so the CIA's document specialists artificially aged them, adding slight wear to the covers, creating subtle creases in the pages, and using techniques to make them look like documents that had been carried and handled over time. The challenge of creating entry stamps showing the false Canadians had legally entered Iran was particularly complex, requiring CIA forgers to duplicate Iranian immigration stamps precisely, including the correct dates, the correct Persian script, and the correct stamp designs that Iranian officials would recognize. By early January 1980, the pieces were in place. Studio 6 Productions existed as a verifiable entity with phone listings, trade publication advertisements, and industry contacts. The Canadian identity documents were ready. The cover story had been developed and refined. The 6 Americans had been briefed on their new identities and had begun memorizing the details of their false biographies and their roles as film crew members. Now the operation needed someone to travel to Tehran, meet with the 6 Americans, finalize the extraction plan, and lead them through the airport to freedom. Tony Mendez volunteered for the assignment. He was 40 years old, an experienced field officer who had run exfiltration operations before, but never one with stakes this high or variables this uncertain. The CIA's Tehran station had been compromised when the embassy was seized. The station chief and several intelligence officers were among the hostages, which meant Mendes would be operating without local support, without backup, and without any safety net if something went wrong.
On January 25, 1980, Mendes boarded a Swiss air flight from Zurich to Tehran, carrying his false Canadian passport identifying him as Kevin Costa Harkins. His cover documentation showed he was a production manager for Studio 6 Productions, traveling to Iran to meet with the Advanced Location Scouting team and finalize their assessment of potential filming sites. He carried a briefcase containing production materials for Argo, storyboards, concept art, location photographs, script pages, business cards, and all the props that would help sell the fiction he was about to perform. The flight to Tehran gave Mendes time to review every aspect of the operation and identify potential failure points. Iranian airport security might question why a Canadian production manager was traveling alone to meet a crew that should have been finishing their work. Immigration officials might be suspicious of any foreigner entering Iran during a period of heightened revolutionary tensions. The Canadians sheltering the 6 Americans might be under surveillance without knowing it. The Americans themselves might be too nervous to convincingly play their roles. Any of these variables could cause the operation to collapse. Maraboud Airport in January 1980 was a tense environment. Iranian Revolutionary Guards in military uniforms patrolled the terminals carrying automatic weapons. Immigration booths were manned by officials who had been instructed to watch for anything unusual, particularly Americans attempting to leave Iran using false documents. Large photographs of Ayatollah Khomeini hung throughout the terminal, and revolutionary slogans were painted on walls. The message was clear. This was no longer the Western-friendly Iran of the Shah's era, and foreigners should understand they were being watched. Mendes cleared Iranian immigration without incident. His Canadian passport was examined carefully, and the official asked about his business in Iran, but the cover story held. He was meeting with a film location scouting team. The immigration officer stamped his passport and waved him through. Mendes collected his luggage and exited the terminal into Tehran's January cold, looking for the contact who would drive him to the Canadian embassy.
Ambassador Ken Taylor's residence, where the 6 Americans had been hiding for nearly 3 months, was a comfortable diplomatic home in northern Tehran. When Mendes arrived and was ushered inside, he found 6 people who looked exhausted, frightened, and desperate for any news about when they might escape. For 79 days, they had been prisoners in all but name. Unable to leave their residence, unable to call family members, unable to do anything but wait and hope that someone would figure out how to extract them before Iranian authorities discovered their presence. The meeting between Mendes and the 6 Americans began with introductions, but quickly moved to the critical business of preparing for the extraction. Mendes explained the plan. They would pose as a Canadian film location scouting team departing Tehran after completing their reconnaissance work. They would travel to the airport together, pass through immigration and security as a group, board a Swiss Air flight to Zurich, and once in international airspace, they would be safe. The 6 Americans listened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The plan sounded absurd. Pose as filmmakers and walk through the airport as if nothing was wrong? But Mendes emphasized that absurdity was precisely what made the plan feasible. Iranian security was looking for Americans trying to sneak out of the country, looking for people acting suspiciously, looking for elaborate deception schemes. They weren't looking for a Canadian film crew openly departing after finishing legitimate business. The boldness of the approach was itself a form of camouflage. Over the next 36 hours, Mendes worked intensively with the 6 Americans to prepare them for their roles. Each person reviewed their Canadian identity documents, passports, driver's licenses, credit cards, and memorized the biographical details of their false identities. They practiced pronouncing their new names naturally, responding when called by these names, and telling consistent stories about their Canadian hometowns, their work in the film industry, and their experience scouting locations in Iran. Mendes drilled them on film industry terminology and details about the Argo production. They needed to be able to discuss the film's premise, explain what types of locations they had been looking for, describe the production schedule, and answer basic questions about science fiction filmmaking. Chambers had prepared detailed briefing materials about Argo, plot summaries, character descriptions, production details that the fake crew members studied like actors preparing for roles. The physical materials they would carry were equally important. Each crew member received a leather portfolio containing storyboards and concept art for Argo. These portfolios served multiple purposes. They were props that made the film crew cover story more convincing. They were conversation pieces that could distract interrogators from asking too many questions about personal details. And they were visual evidence that these were creative professionals engaged in legitimate business rather than diplomats in disguise. Mendes emphasized that their behavior at the airport would be as important as their documents. They couldn't act nervous or frightened. That would trigger suspicion immediately. They needed to project the casual confidence of business travelers who had legitimate reasons to be in Iran and legitimate reasons to leave. Film industry professionals, Mendes explained, were often somewhat eccentric, creative types who might seem distracted or unusual, but they were also experienced travelers accustomed to international work. The 6 Americans needed to channel that professional competence even while feeling terrified. The rehearsals continued through January 26th and into January 27th. Mendes played the role of Iranian immigration officials, airport security personnel, and even fellow passengers who might strike up conversations.
He asked unexpected questions, challenged inconsistencies in their stories, and created scenarios where the Americans had to maintain their cover under pressure. Some of the 6 adapted more quickly than others. Robert Anders and Joe Stafford seemed comfortable with the deception, while Henry Schatz struggled with anxiety that threatened to undermine his performance. By the evening of January 27, Mendes made the judgment that they were as ready as they would ever be. The extraction was scheduled for the following day, January 28, 1980. That night, none of the 6 Americans slept well. They lay awake thinking about everything that could go wrong, about the Revolutionary Guards at the airport, about the possibility that Iranian intelligence might have discovered their presence at the Canadian residence, about what would happen if they were arrested at the airport and charged with espionage. The morning of January 28th was cold and overcast in Tehran. The 6 Americans dressed carefully in clothing appropriate to their roles as film industry professionals. Casual but professional attire, nothing too formal or too sloppy. The women wore slacks and sweaters. The men wore open-collar shirts and jackets. They needed to look like creative professionals, not diplomats or government officials. Ambassador Ken Taylor and Canadian Embassy staff prepared the final details. 2 Canadian Embassy vehicles would transport the group to the airport, reducing the chance that they would be stopped at checkpoints. Diplomatic vehicles received less scrutiny than civilian cars. The Canadians had prepared a cover story explaining why they were transporting film crew members if questioned. They had been providing hospitality to Canadian business visitors and were now seeing them off at the airport. At 10:15 in the morning, the group departed the Canadian ambassador's residence for what they hoped would be the last time. The drive to Mehrabad Airport would take approximately 30 minutes through Tehran traffic, navigating streets where Revolutionary Guards manned checkpoints and where anti-American sentiment ran so high that discovery would likely mean immediate arrest or worse.
The vehicles traveled without incident through the city streets. At 2 checkpoints, Revolutionary Guards waved them through after seeing the diplomatic plates. At a 3rd checkpoint, a guard looked more carefully into the vehicles, examining the passengers, but then waved them on. The group maintained casual conversation during the drive, discussing film locations and production schedules, staying in character even though only their driver, a Canadian Embassy employee, could hear them. Mehrabad Airport appeared ahead, its utilitarian terminals and control tower marking the final obstacle between the 6 Americans and freedom. The vehicles pulled up to the departure terminal entrance. Canadian Embassy staff helped unload luggage, professional-looking cases and bags that film crew members would carry. Ambassador Taylor had come to the airport himself, a final gesture of support, and perhaps to provide additional diplomatic presence if anything went wrong. Mendes led the group into the terminal. This was the moment when the operation became irrevocable. Once inside, they were committed to the extraction attempt, and there would be no safe way to abort if complications arose. The terminal was crowded with travelers, Iranian families, foreign businessmen, and everywhere Revolutionary Guards in military uniforms watching passengers with obvious suspicion. The first checkpoint was document verification at the terminal entrance. A Revolutionary Guard examined each passport, comparing photographs to faces. Mendes went first, presenting his Canadian passport with the calm assurance of a man who had nothing to hide. The guard looked at the passport, looked at Mendes's face, looked back at the passport. He asked in a heavily accented English, "Purpose of visit?" "Film production, location scouting," Mendes replied, gesturing to the portfolio under his arm. "We've been looking at sites for a science fiction movie."
The guard seemed uninterested. He stamped the passport and waved Mendes through. One by one, the 6 Americans followed, each presenting their Canadian passports, each giving similar brief explanations about film work. The guard's scrutiny varied. He looked longer at some passports than others, but eventually, all 7 cleared the first checkpoint. Inside the terminal, they moved toward the Swissair ticket counter. The departure board showed their flight SR-141 to Zurich, scheduled to depart at 1:15 p.m. They had approximately 3 hours before boarding, time they would spend moving through the various security and immigration checkpoints that stood between them and the aircraft. At the Swissair counter, the ticket agent processed their reservations with efficiency. She examined their Canadian passports, confirmed their names against the passenger manifest, and printed boarding passes.
When she asked about their visit to Iran, Mendes explained they were a film location scouting team heading home after a successful reconnaissance. The agent seemed more interested in completing the transaction than in the details of their story. She handed over boarding passes and wished them a pleasant flight. The next checkpoint was baggage screening. Security personnel x-rayed carry-on items and examined the portfolios containing Argo production materials. One security officer seemed particularly interested in the storyboards, pulling them out to study the elaborate illustrations of alien landscapes and futuristic technology. He asked what these images were. Cora Legic, maintaining her composure, explained they were concept art for the science fiction film her team was developing. The security officer nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned the materials. Their luggage passed through screening without triggering any alarms. The most dangerous checkpoint remained: passport control and immigration processing. This was where Iranian officials would examine their documents most carefully, where questions would be most detailed, where any inconsistency or suspicious element would be investigated. The passport control area consisted of several booths where immigration officers sat behind glass partitions, examining documents and making decisions about who could leave the country.
Mendes handed over all 7 Canadian passports to the immigration officer, explaining that they were a film production team departing together after completing location scouting work. The officer was a middle-aged man in uniform who looked at the stack of passports with an expression that suggested he found something irregular about 7 Canadians traveling together. He opened the first passport, Mendes's, and examined it carefully. He looked at the entry stamp showing Mendes had arrived in Tehran on January 25. He looked at the photograph and compared it to Mendes's face. He asked, "You are the leader of this group?" "Production manager," Mendes confirmed. "I came to meet my advance team and review their location assessments." The officer said nothing, moving to the next passport. Robert Anders's false Canadian documents identified him as Robert Baker. The officer studied the photograph, studied Anders's face, studied the entry stamp. The examination seemed to take forever. Anders maintained a neutral expression, neither nervous nor overly confident, projecting the mild boredom of a seasoned traveler waiting for bureaucratic procedures to conclude. The officer asked, "What locations did you visit in Iran?" Mendes answered, pulling out some of the storyboards from his portfolio. "We were looking for desert settings, ancient architecture, mountainous terrain, features for our science fiction films set on an alien planet. We visited sites near Isfahan, looked at some areas in the Dasht-e-Kavir desert, examined some of the old caravanserais for architectural reference." The mention of specific Iranian locations seemed to help. These were actual places that film scouts might reasonably visit. The officer nodded slightly, continuing his examination of the passports. He went through each one methodically: Mark Lychek, Cora Lychek, Joe Stafford, Kathleen Stafford, Henry Schatz. For each passport, he compared the photograph to the person's face, examined the entry stamp, and occasionally asked brief questions about what they had been doing in Iran.
When he reached Henry Schatz's passport, the officer paused. He looked at the photograph for a longer time than he had with the others. He looked up at Schatz's face, then back down at the photograph. Schatz maintained his composure, but Mendes could sense the tension rising in the group. If the officer decided something was wrong with his passport, if he called over a supervisor, if he started asking more detailed questions, the entire operation could unravel. The officer asked Schatz directly, "What is your role in this production?" "Art director," Schatz replied, his voice steady. "I assess visual elements at locations, architectural details, color palettes, lighting conditions. I work with the production designer to determine if a location will work for our film's artistic vision." The officer continued staring at the passport and at Schatz. The seconds stretched out unbearably. Then the officer picked up his stamp, brought it down firmly on the passport, and moved to the next document. Mendes felt his heartbeat slowly returning to normal. After examining all 7 passports, the officer made a phone call. He spoke in Farsi, his tone neutral, and the 7 travelers couldn't understand what he was saying. He could be calling to verify their entry records, calling to check whether any Canadians were on watch lists, calling to request supervisor approval for a large group departure, or calling to report suspicious travelers for additional investigation. They stood waiting, trying to appear patient rather than anxious, while the officer talked for what felt like several minutes but was probably less than one. The officer hung up the phone. He gathered all 7 passports, stamped each one with an exit stamp, and handed them back to Mendes. "Have a safe flight," he said in English. They had cleared Iranian immigration.
Beyond passport control lay the departure lounge, and, eventually, their gate. They still needed to pass through a final security checkpoint before reaching the boarding area, a screening point where Revolutionary Guards conducted random searches and questioned travelers who aroused suspicion. But they had crossed the most significant hurdle. Their documents had been examined by the primary authority responsible for controlling exit from Iran, and they had been approved to depart. At the final security checkpoint, guards waved metal detectors over passengers and conducted pat-down searches. One guard pulled Mark Lijak aside for additional questioning, a random selection that sent a jolt of fear through the group. The guard asked what Lijak did, where he'd been in Iran, why he was leaving. Lijak explained he was a cinematographer who'd been scouting locations with his team. The guard seemed to lose interest quickly, waving Lijak through without further questions. By 12:30 p.m., all 7 travelers had reached the departure lounge. Their gate was announced, they would board from Gate 7, and boarding would begin at approximately 12:45. They found seats together near the gate, trying to act like ordinary travelers who were tired and ready to go home, not like people who had just completed one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern intelligence history. At 12:45, Swiss Air began boarding flight SR-141 to Zurich. The group waited for their seating section to be called, not wanting to appear too eager to board. When their turn came, they presented boarding passes to the gate agent, walked down the jet bridge, and entered the aircraft. They found their assigned seats scattered through the economy cabin. Mendes made sure everyone was aboard, everyone was seated, everyone was maintaining their composure. The aircraft filled with passengers, Iranian travelers, European businessmen, tourists heading home. The cabin crew performed their safety demonstrations. The captain announced the flight time to Zurich would be approximately 5 hours. Everything proceeded with the routine normality of international air travel. But for the 7 people who had just walked through Tehran's airport using false documents and fabricated cover stories, nothing felt normal. They were still in Iran. The plane was still on Iranian soil. Until they were airborne and in international airspace, they remained vulnerable. The minutes crawled by as the aircraft prepared for departure.